Welcome to I Hate James Dobson, a podcast where the implicit gets explicit.
Ooh.
Wink. Hey everyone, this is Jake. Before we get started, I want to let you know that I got to join the folks over at the podcast The Worst of All Possible Worlds for an episode about the interview of James Dobson and Ted Bundy. It comes out later this week for their Patreon members, and it is a rip-roaring good time, if I do say so myself. Also, if you don't already listen to them, you absolutely should. Among many other things, right now they have an ongoing series called Wit's Endless Summer, all about adventures in Odyssey. If you enjoy the show, you're going to like them. And links to their social media are in the episode description. And now, on with our show. Hello and welcome to I Hate James Dobson. My name is Jake, an evangelical turned queer marriage and family therapist. And today I'm joined by the celebrated and candescent Brooke. Hi, Brooke.
Hi. Oh, we're on to the C's now.
I like the word candescent.
What does that mean?
A luminous.
Oh,
like a
thank
sunset.
you. Oh my God, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Brooke, how are you doing?
Doing great.
Summer is almost over.
Yep.
We're here in Chicago, which means we survived the DNC.
Yep.
How was your DNC?
My DNC was wonderful. I liked seeing it on the computer and on my telephone and not having to deal with it in person.
Yeah.
So that was great. Otherwise, I've just been working and hanging out and not going to the beach, which we need to remedy.
We're going to do that soon.
Yep.
This weekend.
This weekend.
Perhaps even.
Watch out for Jake and Brooke hit the beach. This Sunday at a beach near you.
The day before this podcast comes out. My DNC, I worked all day.
Yeah.
Had a sudden break. In that break, got a FaceTime from my younger brother who was in tears because they're taking the family dog to go get put down.
Oh, Jake.
So I had a cute little Mentee bee in my office.
You did?
And then I had a client, and then I had another good cry. And then I picked myself up and went out and protested on the streets for Palestinians who are being genocided.
Okay. That's a rough day, Jake.
Interesting day, yeah. Wasn't a huge fan of the DNC.
No, okay. That's so sad, though.
Anyway, what have you been up to personally and professionally?
Well, personally, I've just been doing a lot of cooking and crafts.
Cooking and crafts.
Yeah.
Really digging into the seas today.
Yeah, I made some tilapia the other night. It was pretty good, but it was like 130 degrees outside.
Oh my God, yeah, you cooked it right on the sidewalk.
Yeah, I did. Mm-hmm. Oh, I want to do a shout out, even though we have nothing to do with this. But after our purity culture torture session that you dragged me through for 4 episodes, I wanted to tell everybody that I watched this documentary on Netflix that was really good. And it is not about purity culture. It is like the opposite of. And it was called Daughters. And I told you about it, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, it's about fathers and daughters having a dance together, sort of like we discussed here on this podcast. But it's like normal and amazing and wonderful. It's fathers who are in prison and like fostering relationships with their daughters. I just thought it was cool.
That's really
and
sweet.
then related to our talk about parents and parenting and the importance of parenting, I just thought it was a thing people should know about.
Yeah, that's really sweet.
Yeah.
I did not check it out yet,
Okay.
but it is high on my list. All right, something to say? Forgot it. Oh!
James Dobson.
Try to avoid that for as long as possible. At the end of our Purity Culture series, we invited people to share their stories with us.
Oh, yeah?
And I've gotten some really amazing emails.
Cool.
People sharing their stories, reaching out through the email, but also through social media. I have had a rough go of things, so I've been less active on TikTok than I normally have been, but just it's really delightful to interact with all of the readers out there.
Yeah. Do I need to be worried about you? What's going on?
I'm okay. I had COVID.
Oh,
and then
yeah.
our family dog died. Then I went to a wedding. It was a lot. Have you been up to anything interesting professionally?
No.
Not things I can tell you about.
No, yeah, not anything I can talk about. Just seeing my clients and getting ready to get a new piece of paper that's going to be expensive.
Yeah, you are.
Other things like that, but not much. What about you?
I'm going to be a supervisor.
Oh, that's right.
I'm currently a supervisor of one kind. I'm going to be a different kind of supervisor.
I saw your name on the list today, and I was very proud of you.
Thank you. Yeah.
But I don't think you're going to be my supervisor, but it's fine.
I don't think we'd get much supervision done.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
What's the last interesting thing that you learned?
That I learned?
Yeah.
I got very into watching the new season of Unsolved Mysteries.
Ooh.
And I learned two things. I learned one, that did you know that they know who Jack the Ripper is now?
Mm-hmm. Or they're pretty sure.
Yeah. They have like DNA. And we have the same birthday.
Oh, yeah.
But here's another thing I learned from Unsolved Mysteries. The last episode was about the Mothman.
Ooh.
Yeah. And did you know that most Mothman sightings have been in Chicago, Illinois?
Mm-hmm.
And I have some news for people. It's owls. You guys. It's owls. There's no such thing as a Mothman. It's birds and owls. It's herons and owls. They're huge birds, and they look scary, and they sit on things, and they look tall.
The Mothman is my second favorite cryptid.
Oh, really?
My first is one called the Snallygaster. It's a deep cut. I mean, it doesn't exist, but it's native to like northern Maryland.
What's a cryptid?
Like a Bigfoot, like a fake animal.
Okay, like the Loch Ness Monster?
Yes.
What's my favorite cryptid?
You tell me.
I'm gonna have to think about it. That's exciting. But I want to say something. None of them are real. They're all fake.
I mean, my third favorite cryptid is a penguin. So
a penguin?
Yeah.
That's a real thing.
They're real to me too.
No, they are real.
Yeah, they're real to me too.
Okay, one more thing. And then we'll start. I have a little trouble sometimes remembering which things are real and which things are not real. I can never remember. Are narwhals real?
Yes, but that's actually a really good point of like, we don't think cryptids are real, but like we used to think narwhals were cryptids, or giant squids we used to think were beasts of legend, and like, no, there really are just like 100-foot monsters living in the ocean.
Yeah, and you know what else is real? Owls.
And that's a great segue into Dobson, because...
Okay, yeah.
All right. So, for the last 2 months, we've been digging deep into purity culture. We started with Dobson's cursed tome, Bringing Up Girls, and we then talked about the historical roots of purity culture. We read I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and then finally ended by talking about a much better and healthier framework for talking about sex and relationships. It was a wild ride full of holy bones and purity balls.
Holy bone.
So by the end of our purity culture series, we veered away from talking about James Dobson. Today, we're going back to our roots with a Dobson classic. Perhaps the Dobson classic. Our book today was originally published in 1978.
Oof. Okay.
Dobson's first book, for context, Dare to Discipline, was published in 1971. So we're early Dobson.
Okay.
Whereas Dare to Discipline introduced James Dobson to the world, our book today defined him. This is probably Dobson's most well-known book, and also very potentially his most damaging.
Ugh.
It was one of his earliest books, so it gives a really interesting peek behind the curtain of Dobson and provides what I think is crucial context to his rise as the defining evangelical parenting expert.
Here it comes, everybody.
Girls, gays, and theys. Today we'll be discussing The Strong-Willed Child.
Oh, I think I've heard of this book.
Interesting.
Did I hear about it from you? Have you mentioned it in this podcast?
Maybe. Like I said, this is probably like the most well-known book that James Dobson has written, so it wouldn't surprise me if it's come up in passing.
Okay, I think I've heard of this book.
But also its ideas, the idea of like a child being strong-willed, it's pretty like self-explanatory,
right?
At least on the surface. And so like, even if you didn't read it or you haven't known Dobson before, this idea has very much permeated throughout the culture.
Is this going to be a book about bad kids, according to Dobson?
Yeah, according to Dobson.
That's what I mean.
In our episode today, we're going to look at the book as parenting advice and what it means to be a strong-willed child. In our next episode in 2 weeks, we're going to look at what this book tells us about Dobson and his ideology. Importantly, we're only going to be talking about this book itself and not the cultural impact. We'll talk more about that later. So according to the listing on Google Books, The Strong-Willed Child is, quote, a practical how-to book on discipline and child rearing, which focuses on sibling rivalry, hyperactivity, self-esteem, and the most common errors made by frustrated parents.
Oh boy.
This is an incredibly generous review. I know we just said that we weren't going to talk about the cultural impact, but Brooke, you should know that this book is hated, like despised. Much like I Kissed Dating Goodbye, its bad ideas have seeped into the broader culture in pretty significant ways. This is the book that's used as shorthand to talk about not only Dobson's harm, but the harm of white evangelicalism more broadly. A great example is the wonderful podcast run by fellow ex-evangelicals simply titled Strong-Willed. In the show, hosts D.L. Mayfield and their husband, Crispin Mayfield, don't dissect Dobson's work like us. They talk more about evangelicalism and religious authoritarian parenting as a movement. This book is one of the main symbols of that movement.
Okay.
So let's start by defining what is strong-willed. What does this mean? The first 3 chapters of this book are pretty much like Dobson's argument about what being strong-willed is. That's going to be the focus of this first part of our episode today. Brooke, without reading the book, what does being strong-willed mean to you? What does that conjure up for you?
Well, for me, it's positive,
right?
Being strong-willed, whether you're a child or an adult, is strong in your sense of self, right? In your values, in your wants and needs, standing up for yourself, standing up for the things you believe in. I also know that strong-willed can be stubborn or rigid a little bit sometimes, right? Or the connotation for strong-willed children being like misbehaving.
Dobson's definition, this is my paraphrase, is generally insisting that things are done your way. It's often tied to disobedience. He does make some room and space for it to be a positive. He does say, like, you can channel this in good ways, which is good, but he spends a lot of time shitting on people who he labels as strong-willed. So here are some quotes from early on in the book. This is from, like, page 2. Quote, most parents have at least one such youngster who seems to be born with a clear idea of how he wants the world to be operated and an intolerance for those who disagree. Even in infancy, he bristles when his dinner is late.
Yeah, I'm the strong-willed child of my family.
Just as sure as some children are naturally compliant, there are others who seem to be defiant upon exit from the womb. They come into the world smoking a cigar and yelling about the temperature in the delivery room and the incompetence of the nursing staff and the way in which things are run by the administrator of the hospital.
Oh, James.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah, it is kind of funny.
It's that folksiness. Like, I see why people are drawn into it.
Yeah.
I also see how he weaponizes that folksiness in really both harmful and also really stupid ways.
You know what's sad, though? Is like, if he had decided to be a different person, that would have been useful and fun. And like Tim Walz is folksy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I will say, broadly, I think James Dobson is a good communicator in that he's able to persuade people and get them on board with his ideas.
Certainly. I mean, that's why we're talking about him, right? He's done this.
I don't think his ideas are good both morally, but also I think there's just so many flaws in those ideas themselves.
Right.
I don't think he explains them very well. But he's very good at like getting people on board.
Also, we hate him.
We do. We hate him a lot. Another quote that I just think is really interesting as it relates to, like, he compares kids to a lot of things. So, quote, buying groceries is not always an easy task. On some occasions, you select a shopping cart which ominously awaits your arrival at the front of the market. When you push the stupid thing forward, it tears off to the left and knocks over a stack of bottles. Refusing to be outmuscled by an empty cart, you throw all of your weight behind the handle, fighting desperately to keep the ship on course. It seems to have a mind of its own as it darts towards the eggs and careens back in the direction of the milk and almost crushes a terrified grandmother in green tennis shoes.
What?
We might as well face it. Some kids have crooked wheels.
Oh,
They do not want to go where they're led, for their own inclinations to take them in other directions.
I have several questions. What does the green tennis shoes have to do with anything?
I think it's just like
folksy
description.
Also, I just put that cart back and get a different one. Life's not that hard, James. But also, kids are not shopping carts.
Yeah. It's the comparison, the extrapolation of I have this experience and therefore it maps onto kids. Not only is that like flawed, put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that idea in a little bit.
Okay.
This book is meant to help parents shape the will of their children. And I mean children. Quote, the most urgent advice I can give the parents of an assertive, independent child concerns the importance of beginning to shape his will during the early years. I honestly believe that the assumption is difficult to prove that the defiant youngster is in a high risk for antisocial behavior later in life. He's literally talking, we'll get into this more, spanking starting at 15 months.
Right.
Like shape the will that early and stop spanking them around 13. So we're talking like the formative years of people is when this advice is really tailored for.
Is he suggesting that you can identify your child as strong-willed when they are a toddler?
Put a pin in that too.
Oh.
So, What does he mean by shaping the will? He gives you steps on how to shape a child's will. Step 1, define boundaries before they're enforced. Let the kids know what the rules are and what the consequences of those rules will be. In a vacuum, yeah, I think that's fair. Step 2, when defiantly challenged, respond with confident decisiveness. Once a child understands what is expected, he should then be held accountable for behaving accordingly. Like a military general before a battle, he will calculate the potential risks, marshal his forces, and attack the enemy with guns blazing. When that nose-to-nose confrontation occurs between generations, it is extremely important for the adult to win decisively and confidently. The child has made it clear that he's looking for a fight, and his parents would be wise not to disappoint him. So kids are shopping carts.
Yeah.
Kids are military generals.
Right. It's so weird because as I'm hearing this, it's like there's, as always with James Dobson, there's like a level of it I understand and kind of agree with. It's just that the what I know he's saying and the phrasing of it is so messed up.
Mm-hmm.
But like I do think you should be sort of decisive and direct with children, right? Mm-hmm. I think that they need that and crave that, and it is important, but not like a military general,
mm-hmm.
right? And not just because they're defiant. It's like because you're an adult.
I think framing it as a fight is inherently wrong.
Right.
Like, kids experience that way, and I understand why parents might also feel that it is that fight. But they're not actually fighting with you. They're trying to understand how to work in the world, by and large. Step 3, distinguish between willful defiance and childish irresponsibility. We've talked about this before as well, but Dobson says that punishment, especially spanking, should only come when a child is willfully defying you.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk more about how that is a losing task. And then reassurance and teach after the confrontation is over. Quote, it is extremely important to pray with a child at that time, admitting to God that we all have sinned and no one is perfect. There is a way that can be done in a healthy way. But this to me just conjures the idea of the child has acted out in some way. I, as the parent, have hit them.
Right.
And now I'm saying, now you apologize to me.
And that you sinned.
And that you sinned against God.
Yeah. I mean, this is really, the shaping here is really just teaching children how to become totally passive.
Yes.
Right.
Obedience is the main virtue of this book.
Obedience.
We're not done, though. Step 5, avoid impossible demands. That's fair and reasonable. And step 6, let love be your guide. Great.
Okay, hippie James.
Yeah.
As you're spanking your child, let love be your guide.
So, those are like the general outline of how to shape the will. Not the worst things that we've read by Dobson by any accounts. But how do you shape the will? By hitting your children, of course. Through his logic, if you tell them beforehand, that makes it okay. It means they understood that they would be spanked. If you tell a 3-year-old, hey, if you do this, I will spank you, and then they do the thing, according to Dobson, clearly they want to be spanked.
Okay.
My note here is underdeveloped prefrontal cortex says what?
I'm no child psychologist, but here's the thing I'm going to say. Kids do not think the way that adults do. They do not use like logic and rationing, and especially a 3-year-old, to think like, I might want to consider the consequences of my actions before I do this, right? They are like all impulse. Am I right? Is that right?
By and large, yeah. So kids aren't just, depending on the age, right? There's also a huge age that we're talking about here. So like a 1-year-old is going to have a very different experience of thoughtfulness and planning than a 9-year-old, although Dobson says you can spank them both. But kids have a logic to their behaviors.
Right.
It's a very immature logic, kind of by definition. And they might have some semblance of this is a bad thing to do or I could be punished for it. But they're not making this like calculating war battle decision of I'm going to put 4 forces here and over here. It's very very blurry.
Right.
It's not very well defined logic. And so metaphorically, emotionally, I kind of get where Dobson is coming from. He doesn't mean it metaphorically. He doesn't mean it emotionally. He means it quite literally.
Right.
And that's really where things get problematic. Dobson says opposition to corporal punishment can be summarized by 4 common arguments, all of them based on error or misunderstanding. The first, quote, assumes that spanking teaches children to hit and hurt others. It depicts corporal punishment as a hostile physical act by an angry parent whose purpose is to damage or inflict harm on his little victim. Admittedly, that kind of violence does occur between generations. However, corporal punishment in the hands of a loving parent is altogether different in its purpose and practice. It is a teaching tool by which harmful behavior is inhibited, rather than wrathful attempt by one person to damage another. One is an act of love, the other is an act of hostility, and they are as different as night and day. If your child has bumped his arm against a hot stove, you can bet he'll never deliberately do it again. He learned a valuable lesson from the pain.
But that's an accident.
Yeah, and even if it's on purpose, it's still not the same thing. As we've talked about before, spanking is a pretty ineffective tool for this kind of behavior modification. I don't want you to do this thing, and therefore I'm going to inflict this pain on you. It is somewhat effective in some circumstances, right? Like if you hit a kid, they probably will stop doing that thing.
Right.
At least in that moment. If they touch a hot stove, they probably will learn not to touch that hot stove again. But that's about where the comparison ends. Often, spanking is not the immediate... Like when you touch a hot stove, your hand retracts before your brain senses the pain. Like it is that automatic. The pain kicks in afterwards. Even if, as Dobson says, spanking happens immediately, it's still not that same through line. There's so many other things that go into it. And again, you're not always reinforcing the thing that you think you're reinforcing.
Right. I also just feel like it ties together ideas of love and violence.
Yes.
Right? And it makes things pretty confusing for people down the road.
It absolutely teaches kids that violence is okay. That is an effective way of solving problems. Second argument against corporal punishment is, quote, I will resort to violence when I don't know what else to do. This characterizes spanking some kind of last resort, the final act of exasperation and frustration. Dobson says that a spanking is reserved for use in response to willful defiance whenever it occurs, period. Dobson is trying to distinguish between bad spanking and good spanking, and in his idea of good spanking, it is done, like you said the boundaries beforehand, it's not done out of anger, it's here's the consequences for your actions. Mm-hmm. I get his logic for trying to do that, and that does feel like it butts up against some of our arguments against that. But the fundamental, I don't care how you do spanking. I fundamentally think it is bad. It is ineffective, and I think it's also morally wrong.
And for me, I just don't understand what the difference is between whacking a child on their butt or whacking a child in their face. Like, I mean, I just don't see it. Like, it's hitting. Then
Dobson would say you have more of a cushion in your butt than you do in your face. There's more nerve endings. There's more sensitive stuff there. And that's fair. But I think that your point it's still violence against your body.
Yeah, exactly.
Many parents do spank out of anger, even through Dobson's teaching. Something that is very clear to most therapists is people have a really bad understanding of their emotions.
Uh-huh.
Are you acting out of anger? The answer might surprise you. That people, including adults, struggle to contain their emotions and not react from them. Just saying don't isn't helpful. A big part of at least my work is to give people the feelings wheel and say, tell me what you're feeling. What does that feel like in your body? Let's slow down. Or to pause them in moments of heightened emotion and say, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. And often there's like a surface level emotion and there's something deeper underneath it that we're really feeling. Emotions are complex. Telling parents don't react out of anger when your child is disobeying you, I think that's actually that's just an excuse to hit your kids then.
Right.
Also, again, I think spanking is bad even when it's done the way that Dobson describes. The third argument from Dobson against spanking, he says, comes from the findings of animal psychology. If a mouse is running a maze, he will learn much faster if the experimenter rewards his correct turns with food than if the incorrect choices are punished with a mild electric shock. This is true.
This is true.
Dobson says, human beings are not mice, and it's naive to equate them simplistically.
Okay, I'm going to scream. That is 100% true of children. It's 100% true of people. People respond to reward much more than to punishment.
We don't just know this from mice experiments. We know this from people. Also, we have 2 examples already in this book of him comparing children to other things and extrapolating bad lessons from that.
Yeah, I mean, children aren't shopping carts either.
Or
right?
generals, right? What about this does not translate to human behaviors? In this point, I'm not saying that it does or doesn't. I do think that this translates to human. But in general, when we're looking at a study like this, it is fair to say not every animal thing translates to human behaviors, right? That's fair, but you have to tell me why.
Right.
What about this doesn't translate to human beings? Is it the size of their brain? Is it the emotional experience, right? I don't think any of those critiques apply here.
Right.
But he doesn't even try to make that. He's just like, that's not true.
Also, I know this is highly controversial in the world of evangelicalism, but I trust scientists. And so if there is a reason why for some experiment they are using mice, look, I'm not going to get into a whole thing about animal testing,
sure.
But I'm just saying, like, logistically here, like, there is a reason they choose mice or whatever animals. It's not just like random. Like, probably that applies to humans. It's like, they know why.
Yeah. And we have other studies
right.
in humans. So we cannot use human beings for the spanking study because that is unethical. We can use that with mice, but we have other types. We don't have to do a direct experiment like that to know that that kind of reward and punishment system doesn't work or isn't as effective as positive reinforcement. One of the important things about this timeline is Dobson had just left the APA. Dobson left the APA in 1973 because they no longer classified homosexuality as a mental illness. This is 1978. Focus on the Family had just been founded like a year before. So he's very much leaving the world of academia and moving into religious fanaticism. But he still very much is in both. And so he's trying to present this like scientific rational argument, but he's clearly just not invested in actually doing that. He actually openly rejects any kind of scientific understanding that doesn't inform his belief already. He says, if punishment doesn't influence human behavior, then why is the issuance of speeding citations by police so effective in controlling traffic on a busy street? Is it?
Is it?
Quote, if punishment has no power, then why does a well-deserved spanking often turn a sullen little troublemaker into a sweet and loving angel?
Punishment does not have power. Punishment does have power.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it is not as effective as reward is for getting what you want out of a mouse or a shopping cart or a child.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Also, me saying spanking is bad is not saying all punishment is bad.
Right.
Or even morally bad. I often think it's less effective in controlling behaviors, but there are some circumstances that call for it. I'm not rejecting the idea of punishment outright.
Right.
Also, why does a well-deserved spanking turn a troublemaker into a sweet and loving angel? Maybe they're scared of you. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a fawning response to say, oh, I was just attacked by a caregiver. I will be on my best behavior to get their love back so I'm not scared anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think spanking is probably incredibly effective in the moment.
It can be.
Or can be. And so just because your child stops whatever the behavior is or, isn't being defiant or whatever anymore, it doesn't mean that that's long-term that it's effective.
Yeah. This is just, I think this list is such a really clear example of him rejecting any real data and just giving folksy anecdotes, like calling them sweet and loving angels.
Right.
He has no science to back that up, that spanking turns people from troublemakers into angels. And the things that actually do have studies and numbers and evidence behind them, he just rejects.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth argument against the judicious practice of spanking comes from those who see it damaging to the dignity and self-worth of the child. Quote, a child is fully capable of discerning whether his parent is conveying love or hatred. This is why the youngster who knows he deserves a spanking appears almost relieved when it finally comes. Rather than being insulted by the discipline, he understands its purpose and appreciates the control it gives him over his impulses. Just none of that is right.
No, that's all fake.
No citations, no studies, just folksy anecdotes and ways of talking. Dobson's saying if you spank correctly, your child will actually appreciate you. And he gives a parable that he states as like a real example where a kid is spanked in public, like I think it's like a grocery store, And a bystander, quote, shook her finger at the father and screamed, "Leave that boy alone." The 5-year-old, who had been crying and jumping, immediately stopped yelling and looked at his father in surprise. "What's wrong with that woman, Dad?" He understood the purpose for the discipline, even if the rescuer didn't. That didn't happen.
No. No, it did not.
And again, I call this a parable. Clearly, to me, this is a fake story. He tells us that if it's 100% real and he has evidence and he's talked to people and he was there. Like, he does not distinguish between parable, metaphor, and reality.
Right.
A little caveat at the end. Let me hasten to emphasize that corporal punishment is not the only tool for shaping the will, nor is it appropriate for all ages or situations. Gee, thanks.
Thanks, James.
You just spent so many pages defending it and talking about why it's virtuous, but also other things exist too.
Yeah, but please don't sue me.
The emphasis, I think, really shows a lot here. He says that he's trying to fight just for punishment as a useful thing for parents, but he's not. When he's saying he's fighting for punishment, he's fighting for corporal punishment, meaning spanking, meaning hitting your child. Mm-hmm. Lightning round, he has some situations of when to punish a kid or not. So, Brooke, yes. Punishment or no punishment?
According to Dobson.
Yes.
Okay, great.
A 2-year-old child is not sitting still in church.
Spank the shit out of him.
No punishment developmentally appropriate.
Oh, okay.
A 2-year-old kid tries to convince me that he saw a lion in the backyard.
I'm going to say no punishment developmentally appropriate.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes. A 6-year-old has suddenly become sassy and disrespectful. He told me to buzz off.
0 tolerance for sassiness in this house, child. Spank.
Spank the fuck out of him. A 10-year-old child regularly spills milk.
On purpose? If on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
If not on purpose, no spank.
And how do you determine what's on purpose or not?
If he's being sassy while he does it. If he holds the glass of milk up and slowly turns it over while saying, "Bitch, clean this up."
Thing 10-year-olds are famous for saying. Dobson says no, he likely isn't trying to be disrespectful. He just lacks self-awareness.
Okay.
A 2nd grader, which is approximately 7 years old, was written up at school. He threw the note away.
Oh, spank away.
Mm-hmm. It was a deliberate act of disobedience. So, I don't know what this means. A 3-year-old girl plays unpleasant games with me in a grocery store.
What?
I think he's just like testing your patience, acting out of line. But he just says unpleasant games.
That is creepy.
Yeah.
A 3-year-old girl wants to play
unpleasant games in a grocery store.
Like soccer in the grocery store. No. Don't spank her. She's just trying to play games.
So Dobson has this whole thing that, quote, if there are sanctuaries where the usual rules and restrictions do not apply, then your child will behave differently in those protected zones. So if your child is misbehaving in a grocery store, take her to the car or behind the building and do what she would have done at home. Which feels ominous.
That is creepy. Also, have you ever been to the grocery store with a 3-year-old?
Yes.
There's not time for all that.
No. It also violates one of his other rules, which is you should spank immediately so the kid knows that that's what you're doing. Dobson says you have to take them out to the car or behind the building to abuse them. That's so much time.
Yeah.
You've violated the idea of what you're saying, but no, the most important thing is to hit them.
Yeah.
His logic is inconsistent because really what he wants is for you to hit kids. And then a 24-month-old isn't toilet trained yet. So, 2 years.
Well, no, you're not going to spank that child.
That's correct. He just cannot control himself.
All right. So Dobson's really just saying, if there's any reason that you believe that the behavior is defiant, or disrespectful, then you spank. However, I am here to tell you that each one of those examples could be viewed by certain adult people as defiance or disrespect.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like a kid who is clumsy and dumps their milk all the time because they don't have the motor skills yet, I think could have a parent that gets really frustrated about that after the 10th time it's happened and hauls off and spanks the kid, right?
Dobson presents it as very easy to understand. There's a set of rules. Don't do it out of anger. Make sure that... But life is so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to talk a lot more about this later on. And speaking across childhood, just in general, Dobson gets really detailed. He gets like age by age breakdown of what punishment's appropriate and how you should do it. I don't want to do that for a lot of reasons. It feels bad, and I don't want to give people advice on how to hit kids, even if I'm saying don't do it.
Right.
But Dobson says you can spank from 15 months to 12 years old. Quote, some strong-willed children just demand to be spanked.
15 months is so little.
That's not even 2 years old.
No, that's like just a little baby.
It's not even 1.5.
12 years old is so old.
Mm-hmm.
Like, imagine being 12 years old. What are you, in 6th grade?
Dobson says that you largely should move away from corporal punishment by that age. But again, some strong-willed children just demand to be spanked. Dobson views the main issue of spanking as that it might impact their self-esteem. And so he has a whole chapter on what he calls protecting the spirit. He rejects the idea that spanking is abusive and lists some incredibly horrific depiction of child abuse. I'm going to read some of them to get a sense of how extreme Dobson is, but if you don't want to hear it, skip like 30 seconds ahead. Okay. An 8-year-old girl who'd been sexually assaulted repeatedly by her alcoholic father since she was 15 months of age. Another child in Los Angeles was blinded by his mother, who destroyed his eyes with a razor blade. Another small child in our city was pushed out of a car in a crowded freeway and left clinging to the chain link fence for 8 or 9 hours. And other children's feet were held to a hot iron as punishment. Those things are horrible.
Yeah.
Those things are evil. But Dobson is saying that's what abuse is, and this, therefore, is not abuse.
Well, that is just total bullshit.
Yeah.
Because there's always something more extreme.
Someone always has it worse. Yeah.
Doesn't mean that what you're doing, that's not the same. It's a spectrum like anything else.
Mm-hmm. As we've noted before, he has this like affective override. He just heightens your emotions so much. And with this, it's this like really extreme example of like, yeah, this is some of the worst things you can do to a child. And therefore, you know, a little bit of abuse. Is that really abuse? Is that really all that bad?
Abuse light.
Yeah. It's not even abuse.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously spanking is not as, I feel weird even saying this, as abusive as, you know, torturing another human being.
Yeah.
We all are pretty clear about that.
It
right?
is not the worst thing you can do to a child.
Right.
Yes. That's
sort of like a null point. Like, okay, great.
Yeah.
But that's not really what we're talking about.
It also is logic that abuse, like non-controversial definition of abuse, abusers use for their victims. Well, it could have been worse.
Yeah, I mean, I just was thinking like, you know, there's being like harassed sexually by a coworker, and then there's being like violently raped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one, they're different, but they both need attention. Like they both, what am I trying to say?
They're both bad.
They're both bad.
They
That's
both
right.
count as abuse.
Can I tell you? Okay, I'm going to tell you the thing. I have told this to all my clients. I'm going to say it. When they give me this, well, I have this going on, but it's not as bad as someone who might have this going on. I did not make this up. This is something I learned along the way. So imagine you have two people on the side of the road that both have injuries,
mm-hmm.
right? Like from a car accident. One person is like blacked out and needs to urgently be rushed to the hospital and has like major, huge, horrifying injuries. And the other person has like a broken arm, right? Like who should go to the hospital? And the answer is both people should go to the hospital. Yeah. Like there's enough hospital and enough people to care for them. And they both need attention and they both need care. The question isn't whose injuries are worse. The question is like who deserves care and treatment. And the answer is both, mm-hmm. right?
And there are not only other ways, there are more effective ways to parent your kid that don't involve inflicting physical punishment, physical pain, and that don't have the same long-term consequences against them. No one's making you hit your kid. Dobson is saying go out of your way to incorporate this into your toolkit. You don't need to. I was not spanked as a child. By and large, I'm doing fine.
Right.
There's many such cases.
Right.
Many people are saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also might teach children this thing about like body autonomy, right? Which is like, I feel like no matter what your behavior is, you always should have autonomy over your own body, right?
I agree.
And that can start as young as 15 months old.
We talked about that in our last episode, talking about sex education. Part of early sex education is helping kids understand autonomy over their body. So instead of saying, go give grandma a hug, it's, hey, would you like to give grandma a hug?
Mm-hmm.
Spanking doesn't do that. It takes away that autonomy. That's not Dobson's issue. Dobson's issue is that it hurts their feelings. Quote, he calls it their spirit. The spirit of a child is 1,000,000 times more vulnerable than his will. It's a delicate flower that can be crushed or broken all too easily, and even unintentionally. The spirit, as I have defined it, relates to the self-esteem or personal worth that a child feels. It is the most fragile characteristic in human nature, being particularly vulnerable to rejection and ridicule and failure. How, then, are we to shape the will while preserving the spirit? It is accomplished by establishing reasonable boundaries and enforcing them with love, but avoiding any implication that the child is unwanted, unnecessary, foolish, ugly, dumb, a burden, an embarrassment, or a disastrous mistake. Sure. He goes on this kind of whole rant about how, like, if you spank out of anger, for instance, or you call your child names, they're going to internalize that. And then they're going to feel bad about themselves for these characteristics. That's fair. And that is a thing as a parent you should really try hard to avoid. Feels very unrelated to spanking to me. And I would posit spanking might teach a kid that even if you put the boundaries and say that you love them or whatever, you were still hurt. You were still punished in a pretty significant way. And again, a child's logic brain is not developed. You can explain it all you want. You don't know how they're interpreting it.
Oh God, Mom, if you're here, just press stop and go do something. We talked about this. I was spanked as a child, and I'm sitting here trying to think about like how I interpreted that as a child, because I was probably 5 or 6, at that time. And I don't think it has had this, for me, this long-term effect. But again, because culturally it was a little bit different, and
Sure.
maybe we might need to take some of that into consideration here too. But it's like, I do remember some of the feelings being like, it did instill in me a little fear of my dad, right? And a little mistrust in my parents at that time. Like, that's what I learned. It wasn't so much about the actual spanking, because it wasn't like, they weren't really inflicting that much pain on us. And I also do clearly remember feeling like embarrassed when I would get spanked, because it was like my butt, right? And so I remember this experience of like humiliation being part of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so even if you don't, agree that it's like, well, I use my hand this way and it's just this, whatever. It's like, okay, you might not be inflicting a lot of pain, but there's other things that come up with it, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know the meaning that the child is giving. I don't think your parents meant to humiliate you.
Right.
But in certain contexts, it kind of doesn't matter, because that's what you experienced of it.
Mm-hmm.
This episode today is not actually about spanking.
Okay, great.
We're spending a lot of time on it because Dobson spends a lot of time on it. But that is like the main tool that he says can be used to shape kids' wills. Or that's the one that he spends the most time talking about. We're going to pivot in just a second to talking about really like the idea of being strong-willed more so. But before that, he gives us a case study.
Okay.
Put on your therapy brain. Child's name is Billy. Billy is a 10-year-old boy presenting with behavioral issues. Not getting along with 2 sisters or his father, hitting and kicking his siblings, problems with the playground and the school bus, swearing, name-calling. He found the house locked, so he broke a window and climbed in. He has 2 sisters, 3 and 5. He was described by a professional as very bright, but writes poorly and hates to do it. Described as impulsive and quick-tempered. His pediatrician says he has everything going for him. He has a limited diet: milk, Jell-O, crackers, toast, hot dogs, bologna. His grandmother still gives him baby food. This has caused his parents to fight, and the mom says, quote, "There isn't much of anything left in our marriage." And then, as a postscript to this case, Dobson drops, the kids are adopted.
Oh, God.
When I'm presented with a case study, like a theoretical case study, this is an exercise that a lot of therapists do in training. I've had to write some case studies like this for therapists that I help train. Because therapy is so personal and so specific, it's really hard to give specific advice based on the limited information of a case study. So I always ask, like, what questions would you have? What places would you like to learn next? What are some initial starting points that you have? So Brooke, knowing all this information, what are questions that you have? What are potential areas to start with interventions?
Can you remind me how old the kid is?
10.
10. Okay. Well, I think I would want to know a lot about the parents' relationship with the kid, right? Are the parents home a lot? Are they not home? What does their interaction with the kid, all their kids, look like? It's 2 younger daughters, is that it?
Yes.
Okay. So what is their relationship with their daughters versus their relationship with their son? When did it start?
Excellent question.
Yeah. Was there a significant incident that happened that where this all began, or did it just sort of happen naturally? Like, there's a lot of questions you'd have to ask here. We don't have much information.
Yeah. Dobson's understanding, parents have taken no steps to shape his will, although he is begging for their intervention. Quote, can there be any doubt that Billy was screaming, look, I'm doing it all wrong. Does anyone love me enough to care? Can't anyone help me? I hate the world and the world hates me.
Did you say that all 3 kids are adopted and that's the only thing it says they're adopted?
Yep.
All right. So then you have to ask a lot of other questions.
Yes.
Okay. So then you have to ask, were they adopted at birth? Were they adopted as older children? Are they biologically related to each other? Do they have contact with their birth parents? Probably not in 1978. Do they, like, there's a million other questions that you have to ask. Are they internationally adopted? Are they the same race as their parents? Right? All of these things are things you would have to know at that point.
There's a grandmother mentioned. Is it their biological grandmother? Is it the adoptive grandmother? I have a lot of those questions listed down as well. The piece around the really limited diet stood out to me. Milk, Jell-O, crackers, toast, hot dogs, bologna, and baby food by the grandmother. I don't know this to be true, but limited food palate might be a sign of, like, sensory issues. Other tastes might be overwhelming, which could be a sign of something like an autism diagnosis. Again, this is a fake person, and we don't have enough information to make any diagnosis, but, like, this is a question that I would have. And if we're going down that lens, okay, sensory issues, perhaps autism, maybe they don't have any accommodations.
Right.
And maybe the world around them isn't set up for them, and they're constantly overstimulated and triggered, and maybe there is attachment stuff built into there.
Now send that volleyball over here and I'll tell you another thing. Why does this child have a limited diet? Is it by choice? Is it because there is a limited amount of food in the house? Is it because no adult has spent any time trying to offer other types of food to this child? Right? Like, how did that happen? When did that happen?
Yeah.
Right? And what are the circumstances? Do the other children have a limited diet? You know? We
get a little bit of more information, which is that this is more or less by the kid's choice.
Okay.
There is other food in the house, so it's not a socioeconomic status thing, although which is a important question to ask. But it is very much he just rejects everything else and refuses to eat anything except for this limited diet. Dobson says that the parents don't have any good tools to shape his will. Mom just screams, and the dad just insults him, like, you're worthless, you were a mistake, which some parents do, and that's bad. But
right.
When you're presenting a case study, because it is so limited, it's really easy to tell any narrative you want with it. It can be a really good teaching tool. But for this, Dobson is just taking his presupposed narrative and crafting this case study to show his point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's such a good point, right? Is that, like, first of all, he's made this up. He's made up this case study. It's not based on any real people. And he's made something up that fits his narrative, like you said. It's like, we could give him other case studies on real clients, and then what would that look like, right?
Yeah. So this is really where I think the episode gets interesting, which is he talks about being strong-willed almost like it's a diagnosis. I don't want to explore it from that bit. He talks about it kind of like this combination of almost like autism-y stuff and then almost like personality disorders. So let's start with personality. He describes the will like it's a dimension of your personality, which is a thing that's an inborn characteristic that is part of you. Personality theory is a whole branch of psychology that we do not have the time for. Also, I have personal beef with a Myers-Briggs type indicator. However, just a brief introduction to personality theory as a concept. There's no one way to categorize all the dimensions of personality. Some attempts have as many as 4,504 descriptions. Others have 5, 171, 36. The mainstream model is known as the Big Five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness being imagination, abstract thinking, open to change. Conscientiousness being goal-directed behaviors, impulse control. Extroversion is exactly what you're thinking of. Agreeableness being like trust, altruism, kindness, and neuroticism being sadness, emotional instability, irritability. Those are like the main overarching factors of personality that most people at least know as a model, as a heuristic. And importantly, each of these exists on a spectrum, right? You can have high openness or low openness, high conscientiousness or low conscientiousness, or somewhere in the middle. It's part of the reason I hate the Myers-Briggs type indicator test. You're either this or this.
Right.
And also, the dimensions personality measures aren't meaningful measures of personality. According to the APA, personality refers to the enduring characteristics and behavior that comprises a person's unique adjustments to life, including major traits, interests, drives, values, self-concepts, abilities, and emotional patterns. Personality is a big part of what makes you, you, which is why personality disorders can be kind of tricky to work with. They're disorders of the personality. They are different than, say, depression. Mm-hmm. The very clinical terms are personality disorders are egosyntonic. They are part of the ego. They are part of the self-concept. A person with a personality disorder might struggle at first to understand that it actually is a problem. That's just how they navigate through the world. Whereas depression is ego dystonic. It's distance from the ego. I can separate myself from it. When I'm in a depressive episode, I understand that something is wrong. Mm-hmm. Importantly, also to this conversation, you cannot diagnose personality disorders in children.
Right. Because
their personalities are still developing and growing and can change in pretty significant ways. That's kind of what Dobson does here. So I have a sample like diagnosis thing written up. This is my language based on what Dobson has written. The features, really, it's just disregard for authority. I tried to be witty and come up with like other like diagnostic criteria. But really, the only thing Dobson is measuring to say are you strong-willed or not is are you listening to your parents? Mm-hmm. And it's a really weird feature. So onset. This is one of the pins that you had pinned earlier. Brooke, when do you think you can understand if a child is strong? When do you think Dobson thinks you can understand if a child is strong?
Well, I think Dobson thinks you can understand that early in toddlerhood. Mm-hmm. If sometimes even younger, right? Mm-hmm. Like 1-year-olds, which is outrageous because personality has not formed at that point. And there is not even the concept or the ability to have the concept of respect or disrespect or like intention, right? It's truly like impulse. It's like, I am going to cry. I am tired. I am hungry, right? It's basic needs. And sure, you can have a 2-year-old who's really sweet and loving, and you can have a 2-year-old who's like throwing themselves on the ground at the grocery store. I don't think that's because of defiance or because of wanting to disrespect their parents, right?
So this is from, there's an updated version of The Strong-Willed Child that we're not going over today, but I did pull some quotes from this. He interviews a couple different moms, and one of the moms says, "I knew she was a strong-willed child before she was born." Quote, "I was playing table games with some friends next door, and I had this eruption like a volcano or earthquake in my stomach. I swear my daughter switched places with my son. He was a lower child, so he was expected to come out first, and she just went, shoo."
No, that's not what happened.
That is describing a crazy amount of intent to a not even born.
A fetus.
Yeah.
That is wacky.
Yes. Again, this is where, like, okay, metaphorically, emotionally, there's like, I understand where he's coming from, but he doesn't mean it in those ways. He means it horribly literally. A different mom says, "She was challenging from the very first day."
No, you were challenged from the very first day.
I do believe that you can, like, each baby is unique and has a vibe to them.
Sure.
They do have, like, in general, the idea of a personality. Sure, I believe that. But not this.
No, not this. No. And just babies have different behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Sure, but yikes.
Before you were born, I read that. I was at the beach with some friends, and I had been drinking a little bit, and I literally screamed. I literally screamed in through the book.
Before they were born.
Yeah. The prognosis, according if you're diagnosed as being strong-willed, it's good if met with early and effective intervention. Again, if you shape the will early on, a strong-willed child can be okay. But if not, strong antisocial behaviors are likely, up to and including murder.
Murder.
This is very much an aside, but in the middle of this interview of these moms in the new strong-willed child, he just, very unrelated to pretty much anything else, just references, like, once again, that he interviewed Ted Bundy.
Stop it.
Was
It's like his biggest flex.
he's so I think he likes Ted Bundy a little bit too much.
Cut this because it's a dumb question, but like, is he using antisocial correctly?
Good question. So I'm not going to cut this. Antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder, and again, you cannot diagnose a child with antisocial personality disorder because it's a personality disorder. In general, you could use a variety of behaviors. You could describe a variety of behaviors as antisocial, such as like before a child is 18, you can diagnose them with what's called conduct disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And often conduct disorder is a precursor to antisocial personality disorder. And things like violating the rights of others is characteristic to that. I would categorize that as antisocial behavior. I don't think not listening to your parents.
No.
Or even in the case of Billy, like he said, this kid found the house locked and so broke a window and climbed in. I don't actually view it as, at least in a vacuum, as antisocial.
Right.
It's a kid trying to problem solve.
Right.
Badly, or not in ways that are socially acceptable, but he might have been scared that he was locked out of the house. And labeling that as antisocial just isn't...
And we don't really have time or energy to get into this, but like, there's also this huge bias that comes in with kids where it's like, whether a kid is thought of as like oppositional and defiant versus like ADHD, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes down to like where the kid lives, what color the kid's skin is, right? Like, and those are two very different paths. So you have to be really careful when you're putting these big labels on kids.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think that you're a bad kid, so I'm going to label you oppositional, defiant. Now, every single time you don't listen to me, even in ways that it would be normal for other kids, I'm going to point as proof that that's being oppositional.
Right.
I'm going to punish it even more harshly.
Right. And as therapists, I think we've both seen oppositional defiant disorder, like whether it was in school or in real life. And it is very clearly, at least to me, it is very clearly different than like a kid acting out against his parents because he's in a bad mood.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, management of this diagnosis.
Yeah.
Behavior modification through operant conditioning. We talked about this in our very first episode of Dare to Discipline. Ka-chow. His whole thing is like reward good behaviors, punish bad ones.
Yeah.
And when in doubt, resort to punishment. That's actually like a crude version of applied behavioral analysis, which is a shorthand called ABA therapy, which is a type of therapy meant to help people with autism. So let's talk about ABA for a little bit.
Yeah.
Brooke, what do you know about ABA?
Oh. Not a ton.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it was sort of thought of for a while, at least I think like in the 90s, as like the thing, the treatment for like kids with autism, right? And now it's a little bit more like, well, tell me if I have this right. Now it's a little bit more like we don't think of kids that same way, where like this is a problem that needs to be corrected.
Yeah.
And so ABA isn't quite as relevant to that anymore.
Sure.
Is that right?
That's pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah. So ABA is meant, ideally, to help teach people with autism skills to navigate the world, such as motor dexterity, hygiene and grooming, social skills, etc. The specific skills should be tailored to the needs of the patient. It is still pretty controversial today, but its earliest iterations are pretty universally seen as bad. And that's because the earliest iterations relied on negative reinforcement, including punishment. So if a child failed to learn the skills that you're trying to teach them, you would punish them.
That's still how ABA is today?
No. By and large, best practices, that has been removed from ABA guidelines. It relies now a lot more on positive reinforcement. The other main criticism of it now is that some people claim, and this is true in a lot of cases, ABA is just trying to make neurodivergent kids act in neurotypical ways.
Right.
Often for the comfort of everyone but the child. That compliancy, obedience even. I think that's a very real criticism. I also do know personally people that have benefited a lot from good ABA. I want to help you understand basic hygiene, how to take a shower and brush your teeth in ways so you can live a healthy life. Great. I don't necessarily see a problem with that as a goal.
Right.
I want you to stop flapping your hands. Which is a typical sign or a stereotypical sign of autism. That's actually really harmful because flapping your hands, one, isn't hurting anyone, and two, can be a good way for people with autism to stim and help like regulate themselves.
Yeah, and also like having a desire to teach someone how to take care of themselves, like brush their teeth or take a shower, it shouldn't involve punishment if they don't do it.
Yeah.
Right? It's just teaching skills.
A good ABA therapist will rely exclusively on positive reinforcement and will make it a lot more like playful and engaging. Mm-hmm. It depends on the age of a child, of course, but it shouldn't be, let me sit down and give you a lecture. Okay. Here's what normal people do that. There is an excellent video on, not ABA specifically, but similar experiences of autistic kids being trained to make other people feel better. It's called The Autistic Horror of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, Season 1 by Patricia Taxxon on YouTube. It's linked in the show notes. It's really good. Brooke, I might send it to you. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like 30 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really good and insightful. But that's Dobson's basic strategy for willfulness. Discipline them, often with violence, for disobedience. I think spanking is bad and ineffective under basically all circumstances for a variety of reasons, one of which being, as we've talked about, parents don't actually know if their kid is being willfully defiant. And so when to implement that punishment is a lot dicier and a lot more of a subjective call. I'm willing to say that some kids do intentionally not listen to authority or hurt others. They're not willfully disobedient in the way that I would be, because their brains aren't capable of that level of future thought. But even then, do you want to risk that? The risk of inflicting that kind of pain on your child, I feel, is a pretty high risk. Mm-hmm. For you could be wrong, there could be something else going on. And again, even if you are correct and they are being willfully defiant, I still don't think that's effective or good. This is a tangent, but the rates of diagnosed autism are currently rising somewhat significantly, but not for the reason that grifters like RFK Jr. would have you believe. It's not the vaccines. This is homegrown autism, baby. It's much more because it's more socially acceptable to be diagnosed with autism, and we have a broader and better understanding of how it works now. If you were or are able to mask well enough, you needn't worry about pesky diagnoses, as valid as they may be. Do you know how many old men love trains? Just fucking obsessed with trains? Mm-hmm. Might be the tism.
Yeah, I mean, people say that all the time, right? Like these diagnoses are increasing. It's like, no, the awareness is increasing.
Technically, the amount of people formally diagnosed with this is increasing, yes.
Right.
The prevalence in the population, as far as we know, generally isn't.
Right.
My question is, how many kids with undiagnosed autism got blamed for being disobedient instead? One possible trait of autism, for example, is echolalia, the repetition of sounds and words. Sometimes it feels like people with autism get stuck on something and just repeat it over and over and over and over and over again. It's not done to be annoying, and often it's not even a conscious choice. But if you don't understand autism, or if you straight up reject it as a possibility for your child, if you tell them to quiet down and they keep going, it will seem like disobedience to you. Mm-hmm. Most kids with autism are not diagnosed until after age 3, although it's very well possible to be diagnosed later in life, including as adults. But 3 is well after Dobson says you can start spanking for disobedience.
Right.
Even good parents might not know what's really going on for some time. Or about kids with hearing disabilities. If you're born with one, you don't know. You're not able to describe that. That's just the way you navigate the world. Your parents might not know either. But then, if you don't listen to them, because you literally can't hear them, that's also going to be labeled as disobedience. Mm-hmm. And so we once again circle all the way back to eugenics. The idea that there's a correct way to be a person, and we should shape humans towards that. And if we can't actively shape them through like genetic modification, you should try to act like everyone else. An outcome of ABA therapy, as we've talked about, is to make neurodivergent people conform to an arbitrary and harmful hierarchy for the benefit of those on top. It's not exclusive to ABA. Again, it's nuanced, but that is a real criticism that actually does happen for many people. Yeah. It's saying you are broken for being you, and we need to change you, or ideally eliminate people like you altogether. The group Autism Speaks is pretty well hated in the autistic community because, in part, their original mission statement wanted a cure for autism, as if people with autism are diseased rather than a natural variation in the human experience. For those playing along at home, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and the Association for Autistic Community are much better organizations. Mm-hmm. Treating autism in a real way would actually mean making a more accommodating society. One example, more designated quiet spaces. And not only would that benefit people with autism, it would benefit everyone. Having more calm spaces, I think, would be a benefit. As we see it with so many other types of disability justice, Helping one marginalized group helps pretty much everyone.
Right.
Similarly, Dobson's methods promote punishing kids for stepping out of line and presented as some inborn characteristic that must be minimized or shaped, and then only because it cannot be eliminated altogether. Interestingly, Dobson understands that sometimes. He has a chapter in this book about what will eventually be called ADHD. At the time of writing, ADHD was not the language that we used for it. But here's what he says. He recognizes it's a medical thing. Quote, there's no more strong-willed children than those whose defiance and disobedience have an organic or emotional origin. Your best resource for evaluating your child's problem is your pediatrician or family physician. He also says kids with ADHD aren't bad or broken, just different. Quote, I strongly suggest that academic achievement be de-emphasized at home. And, quote, the child who is unprepared to prosper in the traditional educational setting is not inferior to his peers. He possesses the same degree of human worth and dignity as the intellectual young superstar. That's...
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, really low bar, but like that's a really good and nuanced understanding of ADHD. It's not a problem. It's a natural variation. We need accommodations, but they're not broken. But it doesn't apply that to anyone else. He very selectively applies that.
I mean, I'm sitting here in shock because that's correct. Like, he's correct, which I don't normally say.
Yeah.
And it's actually sort of a generous, like, definition, right? Where he's saying, like, especially about, like, worth, right? Like, this child isn't worth less because of this. But, right, like, he doesn't apply that to literally anyone else in any of these episodes we've done.
It also does not... leave me the fact that ADHD, especially at that time, or what would be called ADHD, was overwhelmingly diagnosed in boys and not girls.
Right.
And I think Dobson can relate to some of those experiences, so he's able to extend empathy for people that he can relate to, but not for anyone else.
Yep.
He does also say it can be hard on parents. I want to take a moment on this. His quote is, quote, the mother of a hyperactive child typically experiences a distressing tug of war in her mind. On the one side, she understands her child's problem and feels a deep empathy and love for her little fellow. But on the other side, she resents the chaos he has brought into her life. I think this is important. Beneath all of Dobson's bullshit, there is a real human struggle. Being a parent is hard. Being a parent of a child with behavioral issues can be extraordinarily more so.
For sure.
Guilt, shame, and then guilt about feeling shame, anger, inadequacy, hopelessness are all understandable and even normal emotions for parents in these situations. And those parents deserve help, both in direct behavioral management, but also in their own processing and coping. Support groups, community, case managers, good medical professionals, good classes on parenting. I have so much empathy for parents who are desperately seeking help, and I feel so bad that often in their attempts to do right by their kids, many of them have followed Dobson's abusive advice, and they ended up really hurting their kids. Of course, I feel even worse for the kids, don't get it twisted, but I also don't believe most parents want to traumatize and hurt their kids. In fact, I think most parents actively try hard not to.
Mm-hmm.
So we're almost at the end. A little sweet treat. I want to rant just one more time about the Q&A sections. At the end of every chapter of this book, he has a Q&A section. It's so fucking weird. He's writing both the questions and the answers. He gets to make up any straw man argument that he wants to respond to.
Right.
It's also already his book. He doesn't need permission to go on any unhinged rant. He can say whatever he wants. He literally is, I want to talk about this, but I don't know where else to put this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just... and they're often unrelated. In the chapter about adolescence, he spends a lot of the Q&A going on some insane cultural war bullshit rant about abortion.
What?
And the question that he wrote for himself, for his own book, literally ends with, I would like to have your opinion on the moral issues involved.
Like I'd like to have your opinion, James Dobson?
I myself would like to have my own opinion, yes.
Oh, no.
I guess he must have had like a rib removed because he's sucking his dick so hard.
Oh, my God. And then I hope that it ends with the last question in the Q&A is, did you ever interview Ted Bundy?
Yes, let me tell you all about it. I don't think by this point he had interviewed Ted Bundy, so between versions he had.
It's so weird for me to know that this was written in 1978 when I was like in utero, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that like So these principles were, this was a book still fresh on the bookshelves by the time I was like going into grade school, and like this is what was happening. This is how people thought of it. It's really wild. And that's why I keep saying it's a cultural thing from the 80s to spank your kids, right? Because this was what was out there.
Mm-hmm. This, on the front of this copy of this book, more than 1 million in print. And the number has risen significantly since then.
And we are on a mission to find every single copy.
I don't believe in burning books, but I do believe in defacing them.
Okay.
We're at the end here. James Dobson created, more or less out of thin air, the description and almost diagnosis of a strong-willed child. Through piss-poor psychological reasoning, self-righteous farts, and a healthy dose of conservative white Jesus smeared on top, this idea got stuck in the cultural zeitgeist, like the piece of glass that's currently stuck in my fucking thumb.
Oh, white vinegar.
Whereas Dare to Discipline was rooted in psychology, a bad version of it, clearly, this book only masquerades as sound psychology advice. The carelessness and total absence of intellectual curiosity has led to intense suffering of so many kids. And these ideas continue to today. I mentioned there was an updated version. It was released in 2004. And it has sold over 2.5 million copies. Today we tackled the idea of the strong-willed child. Next time, we're going to be talking about Dobson's underlying ideology. I basically only talked for the first third of this book, and that's the reasonable side of things.
No.
After these 2 episodes, though, we're moving on from the strong-willed child. We will revisit it one day to talk about the updated version, the strong-willed child, and more specifically about its cultural legacy. I wanted to separate it out for 2 reasons. One, logistically, someone else wanted the book from the library, so I had to return it before I was finished reading it and annotating it. But also, I would love to have, reader, your experience of this. If you are labeled a strong-willed child and want to share your story with us, please reach out at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com or on any of our social medias, which are I Hate James Dobson on everything except for Twitter, which is I Hate J Dobbs. Doesn't matter. Also, let me know if you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast. I can do all of the readings of the books and forum discussions, but you deserve to have your story heard if that's what you want. Reading this book, I've thought about a lot about my younger brother, Tyler. I've mentioned before that he has various disabilities. Now, thankfully, both my parents are really fucking amazing in caring for him. They're compassionate, curious, fiercely protective, really try to understand what's going on for him. But when reading this, I kept imagining what would happen if he was born into a different family. One with less access to good medical care. Or if he was born 20 years earlier before we collectively understood that disabilities weren't some flaw to be cured. So it was with a full and angry heart that I swear unto thee, Brooke, and unto thee as well, readers, that verily, I fucking hate James Dobson.
Me too. Good job. That was a good one.
I Hate James Dobson is Labor of Love, written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Jake. I'm honored to be joined by my amazing co-host, Brooke. If you're enjoying the show, please consider rating and reviewing it, and if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at I Hate James Dobson, and on Twitter at I Hate J Dobbs. If you want to email us, you can do so at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com. Special thanks to Drew, Lindsay, DJ, and Jack. Our theme music is by Mood Maze, and the song is called Trendsetter. Thank you for enjoying our show.